Jake Tapper's new book, co authored with Axios reporter Alex Thompson, is called Original Sin: President Biden's Decline, Its Cover Up, and His Disastrous Choice to Run Again. That book comes out in just a couple of days, but because excerpts are being splashed all over the internet, Tapper in particular is facing really harsh criticism from people who say, Jake Tapper, you were part of the problem. And personally, I'm in that camp. But Tapper was asked by his own colleague, John Berman, on CNN, to sort of talk a little bit about how the press missed this story. And here's how Tapper responded by saying he now approaches everything with a little bit of humility.
Think of conservatives now criticizing you and the media in general for how President Biden was covered during his administration.
I think some of the criticism is fair, to be honest, of me. Certainly, I'm not going to speak for anybody else. But knowing then what I know now, I look back at my coverage during the Biden years, and I did cover some of these issues, but not enough. I look back on it with humility. Look, what we learned through our reporting is that starting in around 2019, 2020, there were two Bidens. There was a Biden that was perfectly workable, serviceable, seemed fine. And then there was a non-functioning one that couldn't come up with names of top aides, that would lose his train of thought to an alarming degree. And that non-functioning Biden reared his head increasingly over and over. It really seemed to exacerbate and get much worse in 2023, 2024.
Well, recession concerns are making headlines again, and experts, of course, are paying attention. Jim Walker, the economist who predicted the 2008 market crash, recently said he'd be amazed if a recession can be avoided. For those in or nearing retirement, this economic uncertainty is a real concern, very real. When the dollar declines and markets become volatile, traditional retirement strategies can be exposed, unfortunately. That's why more people are exploring gold IRAs. It's a way to include physical gold in your retirement portfolio. Historically, gold has maintained its value during recessions and periods of inflation, offering a potential hedge against economic downturns. This video is proudly sponsored by Augusta Precious Metals, who've put together a free gold IRA guide to help you understand how it works, why it matters, and whether it's the right fit for you and your financial goals. Gold IRAs are specifically for funds that are already held in a qualified retirement account like an IRA or a 401k. Big thanks to Augusta Precious Metals for supporting this video and for making this resource available for free. If gold is piquing your interest, you can download your free guide by clicking the link below. So Tapper made this point on CNN after facing a lot of public criticism, a lot of backlash, definitely people on the right, as Berman acknowledged, but also from people like Glenn Greenwald and Cenk Uygur, people who've been guests on this show, who are much more aligned with the left. And the reason for that is it's fairly obvious if you go back and look at the way Jake Tapper covered the story. When he admits that he didn't cover the story enough, that's a criticism that is just plain as day. It's different than going back and analyzing how Jake Tapper covered the story, which I did actually in Unheard a couple of days ago. I went through some of the mashups of Tapper's Biden coverage, and I think some of it was taken out of context. There are a couple of examples of clips that were taken out of context, but there were a lot that actually weren't taken out of context. And just to help Jake Tapper make this point, and then maybe explain a little bit why it's way too little too late and hard to believe that there is much humility being applied retrospectively, let's start with what Tapper said in 2020. He was interviewing Laura Trump, who he accused of making fun of Joe Biden's stutter when she said that she was making fun of his, quote, cognitive decline, because Biden seemed to be, again, this is back in 2020, struggling to get his words out. He does have a long time stutter, but this is subjective, of course. But in the broader context of many people back in the 2019-2020 cycle having questions about Biden's age, Nate Silver himself wrote for ABC News in 2019 that, quote, Biden's age is perhaps his biggest risk factor, bigger in my view than his policy positions. So in that context, to have Tapper telling Laura Trump that she has, quote, absolutely no standing to diagnose Biden's, quote unquote, cognitive decline when he was acting, frankly, senile on the campaign trail and accusing her of making fun of his stutter because, of course, that's the only possible explanation. She couldn't have been talking about a legitimate problem that even Democrats during the 2019 cycle and 2019 primary era, and then the 2020 primary cycle, and eventually the 2020 general election cycle, but even Democrats were concerned about this when the primary was going on. Even Democratic voters were expressing concern about this during the primary campaign. But Tapper chose to, push back on Laura Trump by saying, of course, she had to be making fun of the stutter. Now, in 2023, as concerns were growing, Tapper did an interview with Franklin Foer, who had just written a book about the first 2 years of the Biden presidency. Foer said that Biden would, quote, pass a mental acuity test. Tapper then replied, right, he's sharp mentally. I think the question is physical, right? More so? Again, we are now talking about 4 years in to Joe Biden's decision to run for president and serve to president. It's 2023 and abundantly clear. I mean, just going back to the 2019-2020 campaign, the amount of age-related gaffes, again, it's subjective, but seemingly age-related gaffes, reasonably assumed to be age-related gaffes that Joe Biden was making on the campaign trail, the list is long. They had already racked up by the time Tapper is doing this interview. So to say that he's sharp mentally and the question is physical is just completely ridiculous. And then to be the person who writes a book about the cover-up is also completely ridiculous. In 2024, Tapper did, to be fair, kind of grill Adam Schiff on Democrats' outrage over special counsel Robert Hur labeling Biden a, quote, well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory. Tapper said, quote, it doesn't seem great. It's not horrible. Then he added, quote, he does have issues here and there. It's not disqualifying, but he does have some memory issues. So even as he's grilling Adam Schiff and saying, listen, what's really, upsetting you here? This is a genuine, you would agree he's well-meaning, you would agree he's elderly, and you'd agree he's had some memory issues. So why are you so upset at special counsel Hur? But even in asking that question, Tapper is being dismissive, saying, just quote, he has issues here and there. It's not disqualifying, as though that's something for a newsman to make the judgment on. He does have some memory issues. Again, we are in the year 2024, not long after Biden would basically melt down during the first 10 minutes of a presidential debate and thrust the country into complete and total chaos. And there you have Tapper saying it's not disqualifying, but he does have some memory issues. And now Tapper is going back, pulling clips of his own coverage of Biden. His publisher pulled clips of his own coverage of Biden, selecting moments here and there, to borrow his own phrase, where Tapper was, raising some legitimate questions about Biden, and Tapper's now saying he just didn't do it enough. Well, it's not just that he didn't do it enough. I would say that is the major issue. That would be my criticism of the media in general. This is the commander-in-chief. When there was an opportunity for a primary, that coverage should have ratcheted up, even as Biden's health problems were clearly growing in and of themselves. The coverage should have grown proportionally to that, especially proportionally to the fact that Democrats could face a choice on a primary ballot, and that the DNC should treat that really seriously, that the president should treat that competition really seriously. But there's very little coverage, and then there was very little coverage, again, even in the aftermath of Biden melting down at the debate. There was very little coverage of the possibility of invoking the 25th Amendment. There's very little coverage of the fact that the man was the sitting president of the United States, not just a candidate to be president again, but this is the guy with the nuclear codes. This is the guy who is making policy decisions that affect the daily lives of Americans. It's just completely insane. And so Tapper, even though he is doing the kind of bare minimum of saying he looks back at this era now with humility, I'm not convinced at all that this is more than a talking point. It would be impossible to sell this book and not conceding that you made some mistakes as somebody who's on television every single day, social media, television, every single day for a major network. It would be impossible to sell this book without openly expressing that you have an ounce of humility. It would just be basically dead in the water because nobody is going to trust it. So of course he has to do this, but I'm just more curious about the lessons that actually were learned. And that's what I'm not hearing a lot about. What I'm hearing from Tapper is more that they were not getting the story. At one point, he deflected in another CNN interview this week. He deflected by saying, listen, the bottom line is that the White House lied to the press and they lied to the public, and that this was a really tightly kept secret among Biden advisors who were keeping their own cabinet at an arm's length until they couldn't anymore, until Biden didn't recognize George Clooney, melted down in a debate. Well, Clooney only came out and mentioned that Biden hadn't remembered him, recognized him, and they'd worked together many times in the past. Clooney only came out and wrote that in the New York Times. It was game-changing to his credit, but he only said it after Biden melted down in the debate. The reason people weren't speaking up at the time was clear. It was that the White House was bullying them into complicity and into silence. The White House was threatening access and was threatening to publicly blast these reporters by putting them into this category of like Trumpy conspiracy theorists. It's exactly why the White House peddled the quote unquote cheap fake line ahead of the debate. The fundraiser that George Clooney was at, by the way, that George Clooney held, is one of those moments where the cheap fake narrative blossomed. The media took White House talking points on that cheap fake narrative because it made conservatives look like conspiracy mongering, cynics, even though, yes, of course, there are conspiracy mongering cynics on the left and the right, and there was certainly some like actual selective editing going on. But there was also many important videos, clips of the President of the United States going around that were not selectively edited, that were genuinely concerning. And so to allow the White House to blow up this cheap fake narrative, it was because journalists have that same approach to conservatives where they're reflexively assuming that everything coming out of the right is bad faith, and they don't do that to the left. And so that was one of the critical mistakes, by the way, is allowing this narrative about Biden to be seriously treated as a conspiracy theory. It's not that there aren't conspiracy theorists, and it's not that there isn't bad faith behavior, but it is that the story was always substantive, and the story did not deserve to be treated as something that was primarily or significantly being fueled by bad actors and conspiracy theorists. It was a legitimate concern, and it was not a legitimate concern just because of selectively edited clips, but because those clips revealed in and of themselves some deeply concerning evidence of the president's health. And the reason people like Jake Tapper and his network and the New York Times and most of the legacy press allowed that narrative about cheap fakes and conspiracy theories to blossom, they didn't have to, but they tried to actually undermine the idea that this was serious and legitimate. The White House told them that, and they agree with the White House, that there's a lot of bad faith actors on the right, and that social media is letting this stuff run amok, and that the American people aren't smart enough to make up their own minds, that they have to be sort of handheld by journalists. This is the mistake that happens over and over and over again. So when Tapper concedes that he made a mistake, I genuinely appreciate it. If it's sincere, I genuinely appreciate it. I doubt it's sincerity, but I don't know what's in the man's heart. But I also think, even if it is sincere, I think that most journalists, and I would include Tapper in this bucket, I would not actually include Thompson in this bucket, Alex Thompson in this bucket, but I do include Tapper in this bucket, just have become incapable of giving the American right and the American left, viewing both of these sides with a semblance of neutrality, and yet they continue to purport to be doing this in a neutral fashion. That's wrong. They are not calling balls and strikes. They do have this really deep suspicion of the right that they don't have of the left and the center. And the problem with that is you should have a deep suspicion, if you're a journalist, of the left, right, and center and everywhere else in between, and not just one side. You can't be, just because Donald Trump is a strange politician that has brought out some strange parts of the Republican Party, doesn't mean that a politician on the left couldn't come around and do the very same. The fact of the matter is, the quote-unquote both sides-ism, not in every narrow particular case are both sides equal, but in the broadest possible sense, there are equally bad faith, cynical actors on both sides of the political spectrum. Trump is very loud, boisterous, and flamboyant about all of this, but to just sort of reflexively assume one side is wrong is just something that journalists, because of the milieu they live in Washington D.C., New York City, Los Angeles, the people that they hang out with, the amount of money that they make, all of this makes it almost impossible for them to really truly have humility, because it's just baked into their very existence at this point, and you have to do a lot of work to push back against that. You just have to have this. I use a phrase from Nick Gillespie a lot: epistemological humility, fundamentally, epistemological humility. And too many journalists are very much the opposite, which is they look at their audience not with humility, but with this idea that if they're seeing clips of Joe Biden, they need to have journalists in Washington contextualize those clips for them, because maybe they don't know that this has been edited by a Republican activist, that, if this is being circulated by Donald Trump, they really should have some concern, and they should evaluate it differently. It's like, well, yeah, duh. People know how to do that. Not everyone. Most people do, though, because guess what? They're just as intelligent as any given journalist, and maybe more. It's a low bar. Now, the other point I want to make is then when Jake Tapper says this coverage was not enough, that he has humility about it, I question the sincerity of that again, and I most importantly question whether the right lessons are being learned, even if you're just sort of giving lip service. This idea that, yeah, maybe my own coverage wasn't great about this, because frankly, this comes from the exact same journalistic handholding and patronizing attitude towards the audience that the idea that the lab leak was a conspiracy came from, the idea that, first masking is unnecessary and then masking is necessary, schools opening, basically all of these narratives that came out of the COVID era, that Donald Trump was an asset of the Kremlin, which was given serious consideration day in and day out on CNN and in other mainstream, so-called mainstream areas for a very long time. We can go back to the Iraq War if we're talking about contemporary journalists, people who were around to cover all of this at the same time. The amount of mistakes that they have made and then sort of looked back and said, whoops, we got it wrong, are disproportionate to even what you would expect. Journalists are humans, gonna make mistakes, gonna make big mistakes. But the commonality between every single one of those that we just laid out, and we could find more, the idea that Donald Trump could never win a presidential election, they were all built of the same foundation, which is that we know better than the audience. So we are going to construct this broader, more accurate narrative based on our set of facts. And, Kellyanne Conway can have her quote alternative facts, but we have the actual facts. And from that foundation, we are building the narrative. And then when you start building and building and building, you really pause to question if the foundation is sound in and of itself, because you trust yourself more than you trust your critics, and more than you trust skeptics. And certainly more than you trust the right. And because of that, you end up with these totally lopsided foundations, to continue torturing this metaphor. And eventually the whole house crumbles. And what that creates is a situation where trust, as we found through the Gallup polling every year, is now tied at an all-time low again after Trump won the presidency. It hit an all-time low in 2017. It has now dipped back to that record low since the mid-70s, by the way, twice. So the last 2 years, it hasn't gotten better. It's continuing to go back to the rock bottom. We'll find out if it really is rock bottom. But the fact of the matter is these mistakes keep happening and the improvement is not happening. And trust is we should be grateful that trust in media is going down, because media keeps getting these big stories wrong, and they're not flukes. These are not innocent mistakes. These are mistakes that are being made because there is a habitual refusal to learn the right lessons. And so once again, when Jake Tapper comes out and says, I didn't cover it enough, that's not enough for me to believe that the right lessons are learned. What I want to hear is why. Why didn't you cover this proportionate to the seriousness? Is it because you were being told by high-profile Democrats, the type of people that you rub elbows with in the Washington cocktail party circuit, the type of people who work for you, who live around you, your neighbors, all of those people? Is it because everyone was sort of like, well, the White House says he's okay, so he's probably okay, and so they wouldn't be running him if they didn't think he was fit? all of those sorts of things. These are fundamental errors. These are errors of sourcing. They're errors of the way that you're processing information, the way that you're looking at your audience, the way that you're looking at one side over the other, and they are baked into the media industry right now. They're baked into journalism. They're baked into just about every journalist's process, especially profile ones, the people who are anchors, super well paid, tend to live in these big cities themselves, and tend to, be surrounded by very like-minded people. And so even when they think they're questioning a narrative, they aren't really questioning a narrative. They're questioning the other allowable side, right? But when you've already ruled out the idea that a lab leak was possible because you've already lumped that into a racist conspiracy theory category, which again, we're not talking about fringe left outlets. We're talking about legacy media powerhouses doing that. Back in the early days of COVID. So once you've done that, it's outside of the Overton window. Those aren't the points of dissent that are coming up in your pitch meetings and when you're coming up with your rundown for your daily show or assigning stories as an editor. And that's a category error. That's significant. And it's not something that's saying, we just didn't cover the story enough. You have to dig deeper and ask why, why. And if you do that, you end up at the rotten core of the industry. And I just do not see evidence that actually what's happening as people reflect on the mistakes that were made in this story. Even in the book, the excerpts that have come out show actually that there were, it may have been a small group, but a small group of important people and still, a handful plus of people who were shielding Biden from his own staff, his own cabinet secretaries, these sorts of things. Yeah, you're telling me that they didn't hear about any of this, in 2022, 2023, even early 2024 before the debate, the first half of the year. You're telling me that, the Wall Street Journal story that Jake Tapper is lauding, and that I think was a legitimately well-reported story that broke open this issue of Biden's health ahead of the debate. That was just weeks ahead of the debate. That was not 2023. It was not 2022, 2021, or even 2020. That was, it was people being dismissed like Tapper dismissed Laura Trump as bullies going after Biden's stutter in 2020. Legitimate concerns about that. You're just a bully. You're concerned about the stutter. And the people who were concerned about cognitive decline, who were Republicans and Democrats at the time, look at that. They're watching, if they were watching Jake Tapper, is saying, oh, okay, easy, man. Like, I'm not a bully, and I saw the same thing that she did. I'm probably not voting Republican, but maybe I will, maybe I won't. This is how the person is thinking, and they're watching that saying, well, I think that was real. What do you mean? It doesn't have to be about his stutter. And that's how trust just continues to drain out of the public towards journalism. And so I have a very hard time believing that the rumblings were not sufficient based on what you were seeing with your own eyes, if you were a journalist who was watching Biden, and the rumblings that you were hearing in Washington, if cabinet secretaries, as this book reports, were not seeing the president, felt like they were being kept at arm's length from the president, other aides, it's impossible to believe that those rumblings were not serious enough for reporters to be chasing down the story much earlier, much more rigorously than they did. And so when you hear people like Jake Tapper say they look back on this era with humility, it's the proof will be in the pudding, and so far it does not appear to be. There doesn't appear to be any sort of structural reckoning. I don't think people like Jake Tapper listen to critics enough to even know where suggestions for them to look, or to find suggestions for them where to look inward and to consider doing something differently. I don't think they even listen enough to those people because they've already lumped them into the bully over the stutter or conspiracy theorist, racist bigot over the lab leak. I just think that's how they've lumped people into those categories. And so good faith critics who aren't just sort of center left and center right aren't even in their orbit unless they're, on a TV segment for 5 minutes to get grilled and then, have a Nespresso and, peace out of the green room. So that's a really big problem. And it just doesn't seem to be getting dealt with at all by legacy media on this narrative as we sort of embark on this great recollection. It's sort of like what we did with the Russia collusion gate when the Washington Post, Eric Wemple, did a long, like 10-part series looking back at legacy media coverage that got it wrong. The Columbia Journalism Review did a massive, that one was a 4-part, probably tens of thousands of words looking back on it at the time. And just, again, even after those retrospectives, we get the Biden health cover up and the media mistakes that are now being admitted again. There are retrospectives, another one in Columbia Journalism Review, on how the financial crisis of 2008 was botched by the media, how people missed that one. There have been retrospectives on the lab leak. The New York Times published something on how media recently, on how media got COVID wrong. I mean, it's just maddening to see this happen by individuals and, publications that will allow this stuff to get run and then not look back on what was done wrong with the ability to make change. And the reason is because the real humility still isn't there. And because people have been lumped into the bully category, like Lara Trump was for pointing out something obvious. Doesn't mean she's like always a good faith actor, but it means she had a point in the moment. And so dismissing people as racist conspiracy theorist bullies, when you stop listening to those people, you stop taking them seriously, then you've lumped all of the good faith critics out with the bad faith critics. And I think that's why we're not seeing a ton of improvement in legacy media right now. So thank you for tuning in. Make sure to subscribe wherever you download your podcasts, subscribe on YouTube, and to undercurrents.tv. Come join the community. We have premium paywalled episodes up there on the website every week, a weekly email newsletter, and a private email address so that you can reach out to us. And if you are a premium subscriber, please hit us up at that email address. We'd love to get questions. So thank you for tuning in, and we will be back with more Undercurrents soon.